From London, this is the Orwellians podcast. I'm Roland Elliott Brown. My guest today is Kaveh Shahrooz. Kaveh is a lawyer and human rights activist, a senior fellow at the MacDonald Laurier Institute, and a former advisor on human rights to Global Affairs Canada. Kaveh also led an effort to get the Canadian Parliament to recognize the mass killing of political prisoners in Iran in 1988 as a crime against humanity. He comes to us today from Toronto. Kaveh, welcome.
Really good to be with you, Roland.
A couple of things worth mentioning, since people may not know about my connection to Iran. I spent several years working on Iran as a journalist. I reported from Iran for Foreign Policy magazine, wrote occasional pieces for The Guardian and The Spectator here in London, and also ended up working for several years with an Iranian Diaspora publication where I wrote about human rights, international relations, some Iranian history. Another thing that might be worth mentioning is that you and I first connected over Orwell some years ago.
No.
I was working on a piece about reading Orwell in Iran, and I wanted to survey some Iranian opinion on Orwell. You mentioned just before we started that you first encountered Animal Farm as a banned book in Iran.
That's right, and that's actually how you and I got to know each other, is in me telling you about that experience. So I read Animal Farm as a child in Farsi. And it was given to me by my parents, and I was told that I was not to discuss the book outside the household because it was a banned book. And they gave me a little bit of context, and it's obviously a book that was not written about Iran. It was written about a very particular situation in the Soviet Union, but a lot of it's observations about how dictatorships are built, how totalitarian states come to create these sorts of enemies and go after them, and how ultimately they sort of end up replicating a lot of the injustices that they were meant to eradicate. All those themes are very, very relevant. They were relevant when I was a child, and still observing Iran, they're still very relevant.
Yeah, I mean, it ends up being readable as a book about political behavior worldwide. It's an internationalist work in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. 1984 too. I mean, I read that years later. I read that in English, but again, I was born in Iran and I lived there for about 10 years. Probably the harshest year. Well, putting aside the recent massacre that occurred, putting aside the brutality of the last little while when the regime has been in survival mode. But the years that I lived in Iran, that was kind of the reign of terror, and that was when the totalitarian structure was being built. So reading 1984 too, I recognized a lot of the Iranian regime's totalitarian behavior in that. So both of those works, which I think can probably be read in conjunction, tell you a lot about not just the Soviet Union, but how dictatorships all over the world operate, and how they create fear in their citizens, and how they as I said a few minutes ago, how they replicate injustice, even though they were originally often come to power vowing to eradicate injustice.
Yeah. So I reckon we're about the same age. So that means that you have childhood memories in Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. Is that right?
Very much so. Yeah, those are some of my earliest childhood memories. I have a mix of memories of the Iran-Iraq War, primarily actually where it affected me the most was during a period that they came to refer to as the War of the Cities, where Iranian planes would bomb Baghdad and Iraqi planes would bomb Tehran. And my childhood memories were of like running down to our basement as a makeshift bomb shelter. And then the other set of my childhood memories are of going to the Iranian regime's prisons to visit family members that had been imprisoned, primarily my uncle. I wish I had happier childhood memories, but that's that's kind of what it's like being raised in an emerging totalitarian state, which is kind of what Iran was in the early to mid 1980s.
Yeah, I want to come back to your family story. So I wrote to you at the end of February to ask if you wanted to do a podcast about the massacres that took place in Iran in January, in part because I thought those got unjustly buried in the news cycle, largely because of what was going on with the ICE and DHS killings in Minneapolis. since I messaged you, the U.S. and Israel have gone to war in Iran, killed the supreme leader, and that's ongoing. There's bombing going on every day. So maybe that means we should start with the present. So how's the last week been for you, and have you been able to communicate with family in Iran?
The last week has been stressful on a personal level, trying to figure out if your family's okay. On a political level, it's been stressful in a different way. I am broadly supportive of this military action, though I recognize, making a legal case for it is a little bit difficult, and it also is a difficult conflict to support when schools are hit, or when it seems like infrastructure is being hit, targets which I think are obviously, in my view, not legitimate military targets. So all in all, it's been a difficult and stressful week, but one that I think is hopeful, or at least maybe there's a glimmer of hope. In terms of my own family, I have indirectly been in touch with them. I personally have not been able to get through, but others I know have gotten through. They're doing okay, though. I think there was one bomb that went off not far from a family member's house that broke windows and all that. But thankfully they're okay. I think in the last few days, as we're recording this, a couple of days earlier, there had been this attack on an oil depot or oil refinery just outside of Tehran that has left Tehran covered in just black clouds, and oil actually fell out of the sky, and there was oil rain.
Yeah.
So that's worrying. That's air that people have to breathe. That's the effects of that are going to be long lasting. So yeah, there's a lot of strange things. I didn't think I'd ever have to worry about oil rain, but I guess that's a thing now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know all the ins and outs of international law, but that looks like an environmental crime to me.
Yeah. I don't know what the justification for hitting that depot was. I have not really seen it justified, but then again, the Americans and the Israelis haven't done very much in terms of justifying the legality of this war or justifying particular targets that they're hitting. I mean, we can explore this further, but I think this is one of those wars where there seems to be a clear divergence between law and morality. I think morally this war is justified to a large extent. Legally, it's much harder to justify, and particularly obviously when they hit targets like that.
Right. I want to come back to Donald Trump's way of war, but maybe we can go the long route, the historical route. So since we're going to talk about the recent massacre, I thought maybe we should start with one of the main historical precedents for mass killing in Iran, which is the 1988 prison massacres, in which thousands of Iranians, mainly leftists, were killed. And that, I know, is part of your family history. Can you tell us about how those events affected you and your family?
Sure. I earlier alluded to the fact that I had been, visiting political prisoners even as a child, and the key person there was my maternal uncle, my mom's brother. And he had been arrested at a very young age, I think 19 or 20. He had been a political dissident. He'd been captured and detained while selling opposition newspapers. And he was subjected to a 5-minute trial back in 1980. After a brutal beating, he was brought before a quote-unquote court and offered nothing resembling due process, nothing resembling counsel. And he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for counter-revolutionary activity. And in the years that he was a political prisoner, he had been subjected to brutal torture in prison. But he served 8 of those 10 years. But in 1988, what happened was that the Iranian regime, for reasons that remain somewhat mysterious still, Iran had lost effectively the Iran-Iraq war. I mean, it agreed to a ceasefire on terms that, it would have gotten much more favorable terms had it agreed to a ceasefire, some months or years earlier. So it looked like it was losing the war. It agreed to a ceasefire. The Iran-Iraq war came to an end. And for whatever reason, Ayatollah Khomeini, then the supreme leader, in his last year of life, decided to issue a fatwa in which he said that basically all political prisoners could be subject to a new trial, and any found to be steadfast in their counter-revolutionary beliefs could be executed. And so all political prisoners, including my uncle, were brought before these typically three-person committees. These committees came to be known as death commissions by the prisoners themselves. Now, the prisoners at the time had no idea what was going on. They were not aware of the structure of these retrials. But anyway, they were brought before these commissions, and they were asked, like, literally, oftentimes it was just one question they were asked. This is like, do you still belong to whatever organization they'd been a part of when they had been detained? And if the answer was yes, they were immediately sent to death. So literally just one question determined life and death. And for others that said, I'm no longer a member or no longer believe in the goals of my organization, then they were asked some theological questions. Are you a Muslim? The communists often, even though they may have broken with the Communist Party, they remained atheists, so they failed on the second question, basically, and so on this went. And so thousands of people, the exact number is not known. It's suspected that around 5,000 people were killed, my uncle among them. And we, to this day, don't know where my uncle's buried. We don't know exactly the day on which he was killed. We just got a call out of the blue, like many others, told to come to the local prison and just pick up his belongings. And we weren't allowed to hold a ceremony for him or anything like that. This story is regrettably far too common. I'm not the only one with this story. And this is something that really, aside from obviously the tragedy of losing my uncle, really tore my family apart. I don't think my mother ever recovered from what had been done to her brother. My grandmother never really recovered from what was done to her son. So this is a bit of family history that set me off on a particular path. And as I grew older, I was like, I need to kind of investigate what happened there, and that sort of set me off on a path of political and human rights activism.
Yes, there's now been quite a lot of investigation of that case internationally. Iran has always tried to keep it under wraps, deny it, destroy the mass graves.
Yes and no. So first of all, back when I was writing about it, this was in the early 2000s. Nobody had actually really done much research on it. The Human Rights Watch at the time, when I was surveying the literature, Human Rights Watch had 3 pages devoted to it in a report, and Amnesty had some initial reports as it was happening, alerting the world to it. But really, nobody had done any sort of meaningful analysis of it. I'm happy that since then, there's actually been a lot more attention paid to it. Iran's government has taken 2 almost contradictory positions. Many times they simply denied that this occurred, but at other times they would openly and happily acknowledge that it occurred, but say that they, killed counter-revolutionaries and people that. Shortly, the context of this is a little bit important. Shortly before this massacre occurred, a political organization and military organization called the Mujahideen Khalq, this weird kind of Islamo-Marxist organization that has existed in Iran since the 1960s, had been a partner of Khomeini and co. At the start of the revolution, and then had a falling out. They were based in Iraq at this point. They had launched an attack on Iranian soil, an attack that was beaten back pretty badly. And the argument that the regime sometimes uses when it tries to make the case that no, we actually killed a lot of people, but we were happy to do it and justified in doing it, is that they will somehow connect those political prisoners to the military action that had occurred, the attack that had occurred on Iranian soil, which is actually bunk, because the vast majority of those prisoners, like my uncle that had been in prison, had been there for years. They had no real sort of meaningful organizational connection to the MK anymore. Those of them that even were members of the MK, a lot of the prisoners killed belonged to other leftist organizations that didn't even have a relationship with the Mujahideen. So all to say that Iran's regime has this weird split relationship with the massacre. They sometimes deny it, sometimes happily take credit for it.
It's a psychological phenomenon. It's an illogical argument that we had to execute a bunch of prisoners because some of their former associates were involved in the war on the other side. So it looks like an emotional response. And then the other psychologically interesting thing that you often see with mass killings is this mix of denial and justification. Like, of course we didn't do it, and it would have been a good thing if we had done it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, going back to our Orwell discussion, dictatorships and totalitarian states tend to follow a template, and this is just one among many examples.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's approach the current or recent massacre via recent history. So Iran has a long history of nationwide demonstrations against the regime. There were some in the last century. So in 1979, there was a massive women's protest against the first mandatory hijab law. There were protests over press freedom in 1999 under the reformist president Mohammad Khatami, who had promised greater press freedoms and then not made good on that. In this century, we had the 2009 Green Movement protests over Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's contested re-election, probably the most serious challenge to the regime since 1979. There were even some reports that Ali Khamenei, the dictator, was planning to leave the country or getting ready to leave the country under pressure from those demonstrations. We had major protests over the economy, 2017 to 2018, 2019 to 2020, the latter of which saw hundreds of people killed amid internet blackouts. 2022 to 23, there were the Woman Life Freedom protests, which began in response to the killing of a young Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, who had been arrested over how she wore her hijab. Those turned into protests over the compulsory hijab laws that had been imposed by Khomeini in 1979 and against the regime itself. Then, starting last November, there were protests over the economy, which started out in the Tehran bazaar and spread throughout the country. Now, the regime has carried out mass killings that eclipse even the 1988 massacres, and they have not even bothered to fully deny them, now admitting to having killed several thousand people. Of course, this was done in the streets rather than in secret in prisons. Why has the regime gone so much farther this time than it has in the past, and why is it willing to massacre members of the public in the open?
I suspect it's because they viewed these protests as kind of an existential threat in a way that they had not in the past. This regime's brutality is not a secret to anybody, and in order to crush uprisings, to crush dissent, they've been more than happy to kill or torture or detain. But this latest round of brutality was really unlike anything we've seen in the 47-year history of this regime. Just the speed at which it happened and the scale of it, really unbelievable. And I think they recognized that these protests had full international backing, or at least the backing of probably their two main adversaries, the United States and Israel, and they claimed that these were actually fomented by Israel. I don't think that part is true, but certainly it is the case that Israel supported these protests, perhaps offered more than just rhetorical support. It's possible that they had folks on the ground helping, and Israeli officials weren't even shy about that. I mean, these are public statements that they were making. And so I think Iran's regime recognized that if it did not crush this protest, they might get out of hand. This is a regime that was born out of street protests. Mm-hmm. The revolution in 1979 basically started the same way, which is protests that grew and grew, and there was a point at which I think it just became virtually impossible to put it down without extraordinary violence. And the Shah at the time, to his credit, I mean, he was an autocrat, but to his credit, he wasn't willing to spill the blood of tens of thousands of people. So this is a regime that I think figured we ought to crush this protest right away, no matter how many are killed, because if we wait, another month, another couple months, we just may not have the capacity to put it down. And let it be a lesson to everybody else. Like, as they lose power and as they lose legitimacy and as they lose economic power, they sort of want the message to go out that we will not tolerate real threats to our power.
Yeah. The thing about street protests is interesting. Like the Shah seems like a character from a different era who saw massive street protests, said nobody likes me, and left.
Yeah, the Shah is an interesting character, and you're right. I mean, it does seem like he's from a different era. I mean, sometimes words are inadequate, right? Like the Shah was an autocrat, and the current regime is an autocracy, but they're almost of different worlds. The autocracy of the Shah was far more tolerable and far more humane. He had a notorious secret police, and he committed torture, but like the numbers were minuscule compared to what this regime has done. So really, there ought to be some gradation in our discussions of autocracy, obviously.
Yeah. And I remember during the Green Movement, there were even some people in the regime who were saying, maybe we should end this. Like, I think Rafsanjani was saying that, wasn't he?
I don't recall Rafsanjani saying that, but yeah, if every once in a while, one of these older revolutionaries will talk about the fact that what they've ended up with has no relationship to kind of what they imagined they were building around the time of the revolution. And I think a lot of them are probably full of regret these days. Only some of them express that regret.
Yeah. So just to raise the resolution on what's happened in January, I want to read a few details from a New York Times piece by Roxana Saberi and Fatemeh Jamalpour from February called 40 Iranian Doctors and Nurses Describe a Massacre, which is based on anonymized testimony from medical workers in 14 cities across Iran. They described their shock at the quantity and severity of gruesome, life-threatening injuries they encountered, gunshot and shotgun wounds to the face, body, and genitals, people who had had limbs cut off with machetes, people who had been deliberately blinded. These workers were completely traumatized and likened what they saw to war injuries. Their services were overwhelmed. They couldn't call for help because the phones had been cut. The authorities entered the hospitals, interfered with medical treatment, intimidated staff, arrested patients. The medical professionals began trying to hide patients in private homes or hide the reason for their treatment. And many of those have been arrested in turn. I'm sure there are probably things that you'd like to add.
I don't know if there's much to add to that. I mean, I think all of what you said is testament to just the sheer brutality and evil of this regime. So it's not just that they are targeting dissidents and detaining them and imprisoning them or even killing them. In some cases, they are deliberately harming them in a way that is intended to send a message. So shooting people in the eyes, for example, has been state policy for, as far as I know, for the last 5 years or so, because they did this also during the Woman Life Freedom protests. What purpose does that serve other than just to have these people continue to live and be out there as examples of what the regime is capable of? It's like the olden days when some brutal warlord would kill people and leave their bodies out in the town square so that everyone learns a lesson. That's kind of the purpose it serves. And not only that, but interfering with medical professionals and preventing them from providing medical help. The cruelty of that is hard to put into words even. Really should give you a flavor of what the Iranian regime is capable of and what the Iranian people are up against, and how difficult it is to dislodge them. Every once in a while I hear some American say, well, if the Iranians hate it so much, why don't they take action? Why don't they overthrow this regime? And it's like, well, what else are they supposed to do? This is what they're up against. They're not armed, and they're up against a regime that's armed to the teeth and willing to do anything to hold on to power. This is not a fair fight.
In trying to convey the situation to people living in the West, I find myself thinking about what was going on in Minneapolis at this time, which was obviously less severe. It was not a massacre, but two citizens were killed during the ICE and DHS activities in Minneapolis. People were hiding in their homes. Federal agents did interfere with medical professionals. They did intimidate people in hospitals. And Minneapolis is still recovering. The city's clearly still in shock. from those two killings and from the mass arrests and the aggressive presence of federal agents there, just like multiply that by thousands, and you've got the trauma that was endured by Iranian cities in January.
Yeah, just over 2 days. I mean, really, this is a trauma that goes back 47 years. The regime has demonstrated its cruelty in all sorts of ways, large and small, for almost 5 decades now. So, yeah, I mean, just think about the national trauma that causes. I think it's going to take generations, even if this regime wants to be dislodged, it's going to take generations for Iranians to fully recover and for Iranian civil society to be able to exist meaningfully again, for people to feel comfortable engaging in the political sphere again. I mean, the whole purpose of the violence of totalitarian states is to ensure that there is no activity outside what is permitted by the state.
What analogies would you draw between the events of this January and 1988?
I don't know if there is much of an analogy. I mean, aside from the obvious stuff of just, sheer violence and cruelty, the context is fairly different. Perhaps the common thread through them is that in both cases, the regime was on its back legs. It was, back in 1988, Iran had been very weakened as a result of the war. Khomeini, as I think I mentioned, he was ill and he was in his last year of life. He died in 1999. So it felt as if they didn't get rid of dissidents, the regime might fall. So this was perhaps in some ways an effort to keep the regime standing. And the uprising this year also was an existential threat to the regime. So in both cases, the minute they're threatened and they feel like if they don't take action, this revolution will disintegrate, they resort to this kind of barbarism. Yeah, I think that's probably the clearest sort of connection between the two killings.
The sense of an existential threat or an
Yep.
external threat. Well, I guess that brings us to Donald Trump's intervention in those events. Donald Trump, not known as an international human rights campaigner.
He's a winner of the FIFA Peace Prize, so that's something.
I can't think of anything to say to that, so I'm just going to move on. So the killings began in December. On January 2nd, Trump said that if Iran shoots and violently kills peaceful protesters, America will come to their rescue. Which, fair to say, it didn't, because being rescued means that you don't get killed. January 5th, he told them help is on its way. U.S. will not tolerate massacres. He continued to issue threats as the massacre escalated dramatically on the 8th of January. So that was a day after Renee Good was killed in Minneapolis. 17th of January, he said he wanted new leadership in Iran. That seems to be inconsistent. We'll probably get into that. January 24th, he announced that a big force was going to Iran. I guess if there's one thing we learned from the war in Ukraine is that governments don't generally move huge amounts of military equipment into a region unless they're planning to use it. And even if they're not planning to use it, the incentives then to use it increase dramatically, and they are used. So he clearly didn't rescue any protesters. I wonder if he just instrumentalized them for his political ends. What do you think?
Certainly seems that way. It's curious, right? He talked a lot about, I'm going to save the Iranian people. I'm going to, come to their aid, and help is on the way. And this was a message that was then echoed by Reza Pahlavi, the son of the deposed king, who has taken on a contested form, but admittedly a leadership role. And he said, help is on the way, so stay in the streets. So I think some people banked on those words, and they stayed in the streets, and they got slaughtered as a result. And then there are long stretches where Donald Trump seems to forget that anyone was killed. He'll talk about the other objectives of the war, which is to ensure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon or doesn't have ballistic missile capabilities, but just forgets about the human rights angle of it. And then he muses about kind of making deals with factions of the regime, the very regime that, he said was slaughtering people in the streets. So one gets the impression that Donald Trump is perhaps not really moved by the plight of the Iranian people, that it really is just, a basis that he used to make the case for, to the extent that he made a case for war, to go in there for other purposes. And he's more than happy to abandon them if he can get a deal that favors him in some way, however it is that he defines his objectives. But they don't seem to be central or even in some ways tangential to his goals at all.
Yeah, one thing worth highlighting is that there's been a long history of people living in the Iranian diaspora in the West, particularly those in California, at Iranian TV stations in the West, calling for uprisings in Iran. In other words, asking people inside the country to bear the risk to overthrow the regime. And usually those calls fell on deaf ears. The protest that did happen in Iran happened due to local considerations, and they were authentic to the political moment of people living inside the country.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what responsibility Trump and Pahlavi bear for encouraging these people to put themselves at risk, and to what extent it was really internal factors that drove the protests.
I think it was internal factors that kick-started the protests in the bazaar in late December. But to his credit, and I've got a lot of criticisms of Reza Pahlavi, but to his credit, he showed at least that he's got some mobilizing power, and that he asked people to come out in the streets on a couple of days in early January, and the numbers suddenly spiked. The number of protesters suddenly spiked. So I think that's directly attributable to his call. In terms of the liability or responsibility that they have for the massacre that happened, obviously, the responsibility, the guilt, the criminal liability lies with the regime. No doubt about that, and I don't want to equivocate on that. But I think the irresponsibility was in saying help is on the way and no help arriving. So that's Trump's, cowardice, and Trump's lie and his moral culpability. And then for Pahlavi, without basis, to echo that and tell people to stay on the streets when either he had no idea whether or not help would be on the way, or if he'd been told that help was on the way by Trump officials, knowing that Trump is not a reliable guy, to echo that, I think he has to live with that for the rest of his life, because I think a lot of those people might not have stayed in the streets had it not been for the claim that help was on the way. People thought like American bombers were going to come in and save the day, which never happened.
Yeah. So Iranians have understandably celebrated Khamenei's death. I guess it's something a lot of people have wished for a long time, or certainly the wish that he would leave power.
Yeah.
Trump is, as we've said, an unlikely savior. Let's go over a bit of Trump's record in relation to Iran. Well, 2017, there was the so-called Muslim ban, which disproportionately affected Iranians who would have liked to visit family in the U.S. 2020, he threatened to bomb Iranian cultural sites. Even had a list made up of 52 Iranian cultural sites, 52 for each of the American hostages who'd been held in 1979. Last year, his administration, having severely restricted refugee admissions, made a deal with Iran to accept the deportation of Iranian nationals. And those deportations continued into January while the massacres were going on. And his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, talks about getting rid of stupid rules of engagement, the pointlessness of democracy building, talks about raining death and destruction all day long, a lot of bravado, even after the apparent destruction of a girls' school in the south of the country by a Tomahawk missile. Trump is continuing to deny that was done by the U.S., or certainly blowing a lot of smoke about it. We're seeing seriously weird videos coming out of the White House Twitter account, which show war as a video game or a movie. Doesn't give me a good feeling about where this is going.
No, absolutely not. I have long been involved in the human rights movement and the democracy movement in Iran, and have always wanted a liberal democracy to take root in that country. And I can't say I'm unhappy about military action against that regime, but at the same time, I'm deeply, deeply suspicious of this particular military action and what the motivations are. And I know that, if Trump was to list his top 50 reasons for going to war with Iran and what he wants to achieve, building a healthy liberal democracy in Iran is not anywhere on that list of 50, right? Based for all the reasons that you just cited.
And just to convey the zeitgeist, Trump, the Republicans' likely opponent in the next election, who hasn't announced his run for president yet, Gavin Newsom, is already talking about the Trump administration trying to rig the midterm elections later this year.
Yeah, this is not an administration that champions liberal democracy at home or abroad. I'm deeply suspicious of them, obviously. I think the reason I say I'm supportive of these attacks is because for purely instrumental reasons. I mean, if it actually does manage to dislodge the regime, because the Iranian people themselves, as was shown in January, just don't have the means to dislodge this regime. And I worry that any future U.S. administration, especially if it's a Democratic one, will probably go back to the policies of Biden and Obama, and they will be much more friendly towards this regime. So this is a unique moment to possibly get rid of this regime and try to rebuild. But certainly this is far from ideal. This is not a war that's being conducted responsibly, legally, with much regard to civilian life. There's all sorts of ways that this can go wrong.
I believe that when Israel struck Evin prison last June, they killed prisoners.
I don't know that for a fact, but I know that it's my understanding from having talked to folks that know people in Evin prison at the moment is that the prisoners were utterly rattled, and the result for them was actually it made things worse, like they were left in worse conditions than they had at the outset. So it's one of those things where, initially the news comes out and it causes a lot of excitement and looks good on social media, but it's a policy that, beyond the initial headline, it seems like the policymakers hadn't given much thought to. Like, if really the intent was to free those political prisoners or to make an argument about political, prisons for prisoners of conscience being bad, I don't think it made that point at all. Beyond the initial excitement of the headline.
Right. I should now double check that point.
You may well be right. I'm just not aware of that. Yeah.
The reason I mention it is because, in addition to this massacre, huge numbers of people were arrested, including the medical professionals that I mentioned. They're in regime cells, which are distributed around the country. Could be Revolutionary Guard centers, Basij centers. These are the places that are being bombed.
Yeah.
And whenever this communications blackout is lifted, I think we're going to find out about political prisoners who have gone missing, political prisoners who have ended up crushed in the rubble underneath these buildings. And it seems that no consideration at all has been given to them. Almost
none. The situation, by all accounts, anytime there is some connection made with people inside the country and somebody reports on it, is that the situation in prisons is really, really bad. Obviously, in the middle of a war, they're not going to spend a great deal of time and energy, taking care of the prisoners. Even at the best of times, Iran's prison wardens aren't ensuring the health and safety of the prisoners, and now even worse. And yeah, you're right. I mean, some of them could be held in sites where we don't know about, and they're adjacent to or part of, military installations. And some are going to be killed. And that aside, I mean, just thinking about, they're in prison right now oftentimes with news blackouts. They have no idea what's going on, and all they hear is just bombs dropping around them. Just an absolutely horrific situation, and is not getting much international media attention.
There's a strange succession crisis underway. Well, it was a long time coming. I mean, Khamenei was an old man, so that succession crisis was in the offing anyway. There had long been talk about his son Mojtaba being groomed as his successor. Mm-hmm. It was kind of like a low-level rumor. People didn't seem to know a whole lot about him, mm-hmm. but that has come to the fore. That's happened. Trump made a strange comment about how a lot of the people he had been thinking about, he assumes he has the right to choose who governs Iran next. A lot of the people he was thinking about were killed in the initial airstrike, which suggests a few things. One is that they're making this war up as they go along. Another is that they're not perhaps as coordinated with their Israeli allies as we might think, because I doubt the Israelis want another regime figure to lead the country. Could be wrong. And that there's, that Trump is drawing a very superficial analogy between what he achieved in Venezuela with what he thinks he can achieve in Iran. What do you think should happen? What do you think should happen with the succession?
Yeah, so first of all, just that statement from Trump, I mean, it got some attention, but not nearly enough. It was just an astounding statement about the, fly-by-night operation that this military action seems to be. Like, imagine you've got people in mind that you want running the country, and yet perhaps you think they were killed because, like, you didn't even think the attack through. And I think it also tells you that we, those of us in the opposition, may have pinned our hopes on the wrong guy, and that he's gone to war, but his intention is not actually to dislodge the regime. As I was just saying a minute ago, like, the only reason I'm backing this is because I think it offers the possibility of regime change, but that statement seems to suggest that that's not what he's thinking about. In terms of the succession, I mean, I think my only hope really is that it causes a sufficient rift in the system that, again, like, there is a cleavage that can be exploited by the democratic opposition, and that some people within the regime would turn their back on it. Regrettably, no sign of that just yet, but these are very early days. Mojtaba, as you say, is a curious choice. I mean, I think most Iranians know next to nothing about him. I think they've only heard his voice on one recording. There are very few pictures or videos of him. I mean, it's weird to think that somebody could become the head of a state with people knowing almost nothing about him.
Wouldn't be the first time that a gray man has become dictator.
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by gray man. Like, gray man would be, I typically think of that as like somebody, a power broker behind the scenes. But I don't think Mojtaba has been even that. Like, he was in his father's office. Sometimes people refer to him as having been chief of staff, but I don't think he had that official title. Whatever legitimacy or power he had just came by virtue of being, the son of. He's not a person that's considered of particularly high clerical standing or of high learning. So it's a very, very strange choice.
Wasn't a problem for his dad?
No, it certainly wasn't a problem for his dad. He's now being referred to as an Ayatollah, which he is not. And the other part of it is like the hereditary nature of this. I mean, this was one of the basis of the objection to the monarchy by the Islamists, saying, how crazy is it that the son of the Shah becomes the next Shah, and like, why should one family get to control the state like this? And now they've
not like it was a particularly long-serving dynasty.
Exactly. Well, yeah, that's true. But I think that generally they had a
only went back one generation.
Yeah. But I think that was just their objection to monarchy as a system.
Yeah.
And here we are. It's talk about. We started by talking about Animal Farm and how the pigs and eventually turned into the people. This is similar to that, right? Like the revolutionaries have kind of turned into the very people and the very institutions that they revolted against. Yeah, so very, very strange choice, and I don't know this just yet, but I suspect that there are probably people within the structures of power of the Islamic Republic that are unhappy about this choice, and hopefully that rift will come to the fore, but remains to be seen.
But again, what would you like to see happen? There are political prisoners in Iran. Some of them have some influence.
Yeah.
Be nice if they were released. Be nice if there was some pressure to release them.
Yeah, that's one of the things. Like, there has been no discussion of release of political prisoners as a condition. Hasn't been discussed by the Trump administration, and in the mass protests that have happened outside the country, the protests that are headed up by people loyal to Reza Pahlavi, there's been no discussion of political prisoners. That seems to be not on the minds of any of these folks. It would be great if those people were released from prison. My ideal situation would be an opposition coalition that featured a pluralistic group of the opposition. So Pahlavi would be part of the mix. It's difficult to deny that he has support on the ground in Iran. But he represents, in my view, one faction of the opposition. There are other factions. There are factions represented by people that are in prison in Iran that had been reformists. Like, I never really had much love for the reformists. Even when the movement was happening, I was writing against them, and I think it was a misguided effort. But there is a constituency in Iran that went through that process and learned from it, and now has turned their back on the regime. And I think it's important that they be represented. I think it's really important that the Kurds be represented, that other ethnic minorities have a voice in the leadership. If that coalition comes together and manages to win power, I think that would be the ideal scenario. We're pretty far from that at the moment, but if you ask what I would like to see, that's what I'd like to see.
Right. Well, when the bombing abates, presumably Trump's going to try and impose a leader on Iran. He doesn't have much sense of history. That's happened before, right? When they imposed the Shah, having overthrown representative government in the country. And maybe that's when the protests start again. And this time it's protests against Trump attempting to impose his will. And is Trump's proxy in that case going to use violence against the protesters?
Yeah, any of these scenarios is possible. Just about anything is possible at this moment. But I really fear what will happen if Trump comes in and tries to impose a leader and succeeds at it. Because to my mind, that's the moment when I think a lot of Iranians will lose hope that they've tried protests against this regime to no success. There has been foreign intervention to no success, and I worry that's the point at which discussion of armed resistance will begin to dominate the discourse. I'm already seeing more and more people talking about that, and I think that's a recipe for disaster. But I imagine that if the Iranian people feel completely abandoned, they feel that they can't, nonviolent protest isn't going to get them anywhere, and the international community isn't going to come to their aid, then, it's time for them to pick up arms.
Gosh, I think that's a real leap. I mean, I know that there's some military service in Iran, and I guess some people have some acquaintance with firearms, but with my experience of Iran, it's kind of just not that kind of country. Like, it's, people are very peaceable. People don't have a lot of familiarity with weapons and conflict. The regime's certainly very good at violence, but the citizenry, doesn't seem to be made that way. Iran's got a large a large middle class, kind of comfortable secular middle class.
Well,
I find it really hard to imagine those people taking up arms.
well, several things about that. One is that the image you have of Iran was probably formed in, I don't know, whatever years you were in Iran. What years were those?
Yeah, like 2008.
2008. I think Iran in 2026 is a considerably poorer place with a smaller middle class, and I think more and more people are beginning to feel desperate. So it's not inconceivable for them, in their desperation and in having seen, the massacres that happened in January and the possibly incomplete or failed foreign intervention, for them at that point to begin to thinking about taking up arms. And the second part of it is, like, Iran does have a history of armed resistance. Like before the revolution, there were a lot of militant groups. None of them were huge, but there were bombings, there were assassinations. The Mujahideen exists as an organization that's still, well, I mean, I think they've given up arms, but they know their way around a gun. There are Kurdish militias that,
who Trump may also wish to instrumentalize.
Yeah, exactly. And they are, at the moment, they say they're in a defensive posture, but they may decide that they are going to engage in warfare against the central state. Just about anything is possible at this point. I think if the international community abandons Iranians, a lot of bad things may occur.
Yeah, I find that hard to imagine. I find it much easier to imagine decades of more suffering under an unjust government than it is to imagine armed resistance. I find it really hard to connect with kind of my experience of the country.
Yeah. That may well be. But I just will say that, just in terms of social media discourse, I see a lot more discussion about armed resistance now than I did even a year ago. And I think it would be a disaster for a lot of the reasons that you say. Iranians don't really have a ton of military training. This is a regime that will have far better arms and far stronger arms and much more willing to use it. And even if it was to succeed, even if an armed struggle was to succeed, like having a population that's got tons of guns just floating around, that's not a recipe for a very good future. And there aren't too many examples of armed struggles that have won and have ultimately established liberal democracies. That's not a model that typically works. So there's a lot that can go wrong. I don't think you're set up for success in that scenario.
That's what we call the American model.
Well, yeah, I guess the American, that's the one example. But by and large, I think they tend to replicate some sort of dictatorship.
Yeah, when I was working on Iran, the line from a lot of Iranian journalists in the West, in the diaspora, especially those who'd lived through the revolution, was that, and the Iranian Revolution was actually not. The initial overthrow of the Shah was not a particularly violent process. It was effected through street protests. Of course, it became immensely violent as soon as Khomeini was in power. Mm-hmm. There was immense state violence and human rights abuses, but the actual overthrow of the Shah was not particularly violent. Mm-hmm. But they were saying that the revolution that they lived through was so terrible that even if they despised the regime, they thought the reformists were worth a try. Mm-hmm. The various attempts to bolster the credibility of reformists was worth a try because the alternative was so terrible. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember having this argument a lot back in the early 2000s and 2008, 2009, where I would tell people, like, the reform path is going to fail, which it did. So I guess I was proved right in that respect. But the counter argument always was exactly as you say, like, who's got appetite for another revolution? Who wants that? Now, it's funny nowadays for some of these former reformists who had no appetite for any of this kind of stuff to have become, hard right supporters of, like, a return of the monarchy and trying to argue that they and not people like me are kind of better representatives of regime change. So there's an irony there. But yeah, I mean, I think it was a very, very traumatic experience. There was a real sense of rupture in people's lives, and revolutions are like that, obviously. Yeah, so I think if we don't succeed in overthrowing the regime soon, this can go in very ugly directions.
What you're saying just brings back a memory. I was in Toronto in 2009, and I was speaking to an older man who had lived through the revolution, had been imprisoned under both the Shah and the Islamic Republic, and the Green Movement was in the news, and I asked him about it. Said, I think this time it looked like Mousavi still might win, and I said to him, does this look good? Is there a chance of hope here? And he just looked at me like I was insane. He said, no, these people are real murderers. And he meant all of them.
Yeah, all of them. I mean, Mousavi was prime minister during the time of the 1988 massacre. He may not have been legally culpable for what happened, but certainly morally he was well aware of these executions. And he kept his role, and he didn't say a word and did not resign. And till very recently, I mean, I think in the last couple of months, he's made a couple of statements saying like he wants to move on from the Islamic Republic. But until very recently, I mean, he was still loyal to the system that carried out these massacres and has held him under house arrest for, 15 years now, something like that. So yeah, these guys are not the reformists, who are not cut from a different cloth than the so-called hardliners. Really, they're all part of the same system.
God, it's so bleak, isn't it?
It is bleak. It is really bleak. Yeah.
At the same time, in these dark political times, you just think like everyone can do something, right? You are a guy who has a day job, but you're also a very good citizen who's been working on this stuff for years. I do a podcast that's largely to do with Russia, but I was moved to make this episode. So everyone can do something. It just feels like the main thing is not to be passive.
Yeah, I think that's right. For me, at least, I don't know. Giving up hope is not an option. Right? I have been fighting for a free Iran for a long time, and I will continue to fight for a free Iran if Iran is not freed as a result of this conflict. That's really all you can do, and you can. There's a line I often cite from it's a song by a Canadian singer named Bruce Cockburn. You gotta kick at the darkness till it bleeds daylight. You just have to keep kicking at it, and every once in a while, dictatorship falls and democracy takes hold. That's really all you can hope for.
Yeah, it's probably a good place to leave it, Kaveh.
Yeah,
hoping for better days.
I hope so too.
Right, so you are on X at Kaveh Shahrooz, Instagram at Kaveh Shahrooz. Any other socials we should know about?
No, I think those are the two main ones. One of these days I will have a Substack, but that day's not today.
You can follow the Orwellian Substack at theorwellians.substack.com. I'm on X at Roland E. Brown, Instagram at Roland Elliott Brown. You can find my long-form articles in New Lines magazine. Most importantly, I want the Orwellians to be viewer-supported, and I've put a donation link in the notes under the YouTube video, so please donate. Thanks, Kaveh. Hoping for better days in Iran.
Thank you so much, Roland. This was great.
Thank you.